Welcome back to boring bedtime history, everyone. What if I told you that behind the glowing chandeliers, fine dining, and music drifting through the grand halls of the world's most luxurious ship, there was another world waiting, one of ice, darkness, and unimaginable fear. Tonight we step aboard the RMS Titanic on the night of April 14th, 1912, and live the experience through the eyes of a passenger as the unsinkable dream becomes a nightmare. For those in first class, it was silk gowns, crystal glasses, and confidence that nothing could disturb their voyage. For those in steerage, it was tight bunks, laughter, and the hope of a new life in America. And for the crew, it was endless duty, shoveling coal, polishing silver, or manning the decks under the cold stars. But within hours, every barrier of class and comfort would collapse into the same terrible reality, the icy Atlantic. This wasn't just the sinking of a ship, it was the unraveling of certainty. It was the test of courage, sacrifice, and survival when technology, pride, and human limits met the merciless sea. So before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories of history. And in the comments tell me, if you were on the Titanic that night, would you have waited calmly for orders or fought to find your own way to survive? Now dim the lights, let the quiet hum of the ocean fill your mind and settle in. Together, we'll step back into the glittering decks and shadowed passageways of the Titanic. On the very night her promise turned to tragedy. Let's set the scene. The Titanic's last Sunday, April 14, 1912, began as any other day on the world's newest and grandest ship. Morning sunlight touched the polished brass of the first-class staircases, gleamed on the dining saloon's white linen, and flickered on the carved wood of lounges and reading rooms. Passengers woke to a calm Atlantic and a steady rhythm underfoot. The quiet strength of engines pushing the great liner westward toward New York. Our story narrows to one second-class passenger, a schoolmaster traveling alone. His name could be any drawn from the lists of survivors and victims, for many accounts echo the same feelings. He carried a notebook, his sharp eye noting details of shipboard life. He breakfasted on eggs, bacon, and rolls, impressed by the service and the civility of his fellow passengers. He spent the afternoon walking the promenade, marveling at the scale of the vessel. The Titanic was not merely a ship, it felt like a floating city, ordered and secure, carrying over 2,200 souls through a calm, bright sea. By evening the weather had grown sharper. The wind on deck forced many indoors. Still, some lingered in chairs wrapped in rugs or paced the length of the promenade for exercise. The sky cleared, and the stars appeared brilliant, scattered like frozen sparks across the heavens. It was said later that the sea looked like glass, so unnaturally smooth that even seasoned sailors found it unsettling. There was no moon, only the faint shine of starlight. That eerie calm meant the lookouts in the crow's nest could not rely on breaking waves to spot obstacles. In the first-class dining saloon, dinner stretched for hours. Gentlemen ordered wine and cigars. Ladies laughed softly, leaning toward one another across polished tables. John Jacob Astor and his young wife, Madeleine, dined quietly. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the department store magnate, and his wife, enjoyed a simple meal and retired early. Margaret Brown of Denver, later immortalized as the unsinkable Molly, lingered in conversation and laughter. Elsewhere, Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet enjoyed the splendor of the evening, while young Jack Thayer walked the decks with friends, speaking of sport and the promise of New York. Down in third class, life was plainer, but no less full of spirit. Families gathered in common rooms. Some played fiddles, sang songs, and stamped their boots to drive out the chill. Children darted through narrow corridors while their parents swapped stories of home and dreams of America. The contrast between the worlds of first, second, and third class was sharp, yet the same sense of safety covered them all. The Titanic felt invincible, her size alone a comfort. On the boat deck, Officers kept routine watches. Captain Edward J. Smith, nearing the end of his distinguished career, walked quietly, exchanging words with his crew. First Officer William Murdoch, Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, and others checked compasses, scanned horizons, and monitored the steady 21-knot pace. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, spent part of the evening inspecting staterooms and chatting with stewards, always attentive to detail. And J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, paced briskly, basking in the success of a voyage that was unfolding as triumphantly as advertised. In the wireless cabin, high on the boat deck, two young men worked tirelessly. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, sat with his receiver cap pressed to one ear, sending and receiving messages through the Marconi system. Harold Bride, his junior, tried to rest before his midnight shift. The air crackled with traffic, passenger telegrams bound for Cape Race, Newfoundland, where they would be relayed inland. The operators had struggled with equipment earlier in the day, but now the signals came strong. They worked feverishly to clear the backlog. Among the many private messages were warnings of ice from ships farther west, reporting dangerous bergs scattered across the shipping lanes. Some warnings were noted and passed forward. Others were set aside, buried under the avalanche of personal traffic. At about 9 o'clock, the Californian, a small Leyland liner, sent a wireless message warning of ice directly ahead. Phillips, busy with Cape Race traffic, dismissed it curtly, snapping back for the Californian to stop interfering. The message was never relayed to the bridge. Such small moments, lost in the press of ordinary duty, would later echo with haunting weight. By 10 o'clock, the lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, climbed into the crow's nest. They had no binoculars. A case containing them had been left behind, and the key was missing. They relied only on trained eyes and the faint contrast of black ice against darker water. The cold bit at their fingers, and they stamped their feet to keep warm, scanning ceaselessly as the ship drove on through the night. Our schoolmaster, notebook in hand, took a final turn on deck before bed. He admired the starlight reflected on the flat sea, the faint bow waves sliding ahead like silver thread. He marveled at the ship's stillness, the way her engines thrummed steady and strong beneath the deck plates. To him, the Titanic embodied modern confidence, a promise that technology could master nature. He returned to his cabin, scribbled a few observations, and lay down to rest, believing that in 3 days he would see the skyline of New York. The ship pressed on, a moving palace of light across the dark Atlantic. Behind closed doors, stewardesses folded linen, pantry workers cleared dishes, and stokers below shoveled coal into roaring furnaces. The band played one last tune before retiring. The promenade emptied. On the bridge, Murdoch checked his watch. The log marked steady progress. All seemed quiet, ordered and secure, and so the Titanic moved into the last hour of peace. At 11:30 p.m., the decks were quiet. A few couples strolled, bundled in heavy coats, their breath silver in the cold. Stewards secured deck chairs and checked doors. The lights of the great ship glowed warmly through windows, throwing a faint halo across the lifeboats, lined neatly along the boat deck. Inside, most passengers slept, lulled by the steady hum of machinery. The sea remained unnaturally calm, like black glass stretched to the horizon. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee kept their lonely watch. The cold gnawed at their hands and feet, but they peered forward, straining to distinguish anything darker than the night. Without binoculars, their task was doubly hard. The Atlantic seemed empty, yet they knew from scattered wireless reports that ice lay somewhere ahead. Fleet rubbed his eyes and shifted his stance. The minutes dragged. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch paced quietly, glancing at the compass and the clock. The Titanic held a brisk 21 knots, a pace that would bring her into New York on schedule. Captain Smith rested nearby, confident that his officers had the ship well in hand. The log was steady, the weather clear, the stars bright. Everything suggested a perfect night for steaming. Below, in the Marconi room, Jack Phillips tapped furiously at his key. The backlog of passenger messages seemed endless, and the signals from Cape Race came in strongly now that night had fallen. Harold Bride, the junior operator, stirred awake, preparing for his midnight relief. Neither man knew that within minutes their instruments would become the ship's most vital lifeline. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet squinted into the darkness. Something broke the horizon. It looked like a shadow, a smudge against the stars. At first he thought his eyes deceived him, but the shape grew darker, more solid. His heart jolted. He rang the bell 3 times, the signal for danger, and grabbed the phone. "Iceberg right ahead," he shouted to the bridge. Murdoch reacted instantly. He ordered, "Hard a starboard," and the helmsman spun the wheel. The engine telegraphs clanged, signaling full astern. Down in the engine room, men leapt to obey, the roar of machinery shifting as the order coursed through the ship's veins. The Titanic began to turn, her vast hull reluctant to obey the sudden command. Seconds later, the starboard bow scraped against ice. The sound was strange, muted, like tearing fabric, grinding steel, or a dull thud. On the upper decks it felt like a gentle shiver, barely more than a tremor. In the smoking rooms and cabins, many passengers felt nothing at all. Some stirred, puzzled by the faint vibration, then settled back to bed. But below, in the forward boiler rooms, the reality was brutal. Steel plates buckled, seams split, and rivets popped like rifle shots. Seawater burst through jagged openings, cascading into compartments. Men staggered, knocked off their feet. Some scrambled up ladders to escape, while others rushed to close watertight doors. The Atlantic surged in, unstoppable. Within minutes, 6 compartments were flooding. Thomas Andrews had designed Titanic to remain afloat, with up to 4 flooded. 6 was beyond her limits. The ocean had torn a gash more than 300 feet long. The ship was fatally wounded. Captain Smith hurried to the bridge, summoned from his quarters by the jolt and Murdoch's urgent report. Together with Andrews, he surveyed the damage. The designer returned grim-faced after inspecting the forward spaces. His verdict was swift and devastating. Titanic would sink. Not immediately, but within 2 or 3 hours. On deck, passengers grew curious. Some had seen chunks of ice that had fallen onto the forward well deck. They laughed, tossing them like snowballs, unaware of the catastrophe beneath their feet. Others stood at the rails, peering into the night, puzzled by the sudden halt of the engines. The atmosphere was uneasy, but not yet fearful. Stewards reassured passengers that nothing was wrong, that precautions were routine. In the mailroom, clerks worked desperately, dragging heavy sacks of letters to higher decks. The mail was the pride of the ship, and they struggled against rising water even as it sloshed about their boots. In the squash court and crew quarters forward, icy water surged unchecked, swallowing everything in its path. In second class, our schoolmaster woke fully from his light doze. Startled by the vibration, he dressed quickly and stepped into the corridor. Other passengers did the same, asking questions of stewards who told them to remain calm. He felt the faintest tilt under his feet, as though the deck leaned slightly forward. It was subtle, but it stirred unease in his gut. He climbed toward the promenade for a clearer view. Above, the order went out to uncover the lifeboats. Sailors removed tarpaulins, tested tackle, and swung out davits. Few passengers paid attention. The Titanic was unsinkable, everyone said. The lifeboats seemed unnecessary, even ridiculous on such a mighty ship. Some passengers joked about the precaution, turning back to their cabins for coats or cameras. In the wireless cabin, the first distress signals sparked to life. Jack Phillips tapped out CQD on the key, the traditional call of distress. Bride suggested they try the newer signal, SOS. Phillips grinned grimly and sent both. Across the ocean, the messages leapt into the ether. "Come at once. We have struck an iceberg. Sinking." The night was no longer peaceful. The Titanic's fate was sealed, though most aboard did not yet know it. Above, the stars still glittered, the sea still shone like black glass. But below the waterline, the Atlantic was rushing in, relentless, and the great ship was dying. The Titanic slowed to a halt after the impact, her great engines stilled. For a moment the silence was uncanny. Passengers accustomed to the steady thrum beneath their feet noticed its absence at once. In cabins, lounges, and corridors, the quiet raised questions. Why had the ship stopped? What was happening out in the cold night? On the bridge, Captain Smith listened grimly as Thomas Andrews explained the damage. 6 compartments were open to the sea. The watertight bulkheads did not rise high enough to keep water from spilling over one into another, like a staircase filling step by step. Andrews calculated swiftly, his pencil scratching on a scrap of paper. The ship had perhaps 2 hours, 3 at the most. Smith stared into the darkness, absorbing the terrible truth. His command, the largest ship in the world, would not see the morning. Orders spread quickly. The lifeboats were to be uncovered and swung out. Stewards were instructed to rouse passengers and advise them to dress warmly, collect life jackets, and come on deck. At first, these instructions met with disbelief. The Titanic was unsinkable, wasn't it? Surely the officers were only being cautious. Many passengers laughed or resisted, refusing to leave warm cabins for the freezing night. Our second-class schoolmaster, uneasy since the jolt, now joined others climbing toward the promenade. He found sailors tugging at tarpaulins, exposing lifeboats he had barely noticed during the voyage. The men moved briskly, their faces tight. The sight unsettled him. He pulled his coat tighter and looked down the long stretch of deck, where clusters of people gathered, murmuring. Some stewards reassured them with calm voices, but the nervous edge in their tone betrayed the truth. In first class, disbelief lingered. John Jacob Astor and his wife asked a steward what had happened. He assured them it was nothing serious. Benjamin Guggenheim, dapper in evening wear, shrugged off the disturbance and returned to his room. Margaret Brown urged others to put on warmer clothes, sensing that the cold air meant serious trouble. Isidore and Ida Strauss refused to hurry, preferring to remain in their suite until the matter was clear. Down in steerage, the situation was more confusing. Language barriers made communication difficult. Families from Ireland, Scandinavia, Syria, and Eastern Europe tried to interpret the urgency of stewards who struggled to make themselves understood. Many hesitated, reluctant to abandon bunks and children for the unknown. Some clung to their belongings, not wanting to leave behind the few possessions they had carried across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the mail clerks fought a losing battle. The mail hold filled rapidly, icy water rising past their waists. They dragged sacks upward, clinging to duty even as their world collapsed. Below them, the forward boiler rooms thundered with the sound of rushing sea. Stokers scrambled for ladders as water surged in, forcing men to retreat step by step. Titanic's heart was being drowned. On the boat deck, the officers organized their men. Charles Lightoller, the second officer, was strict and methodical. He ordered women and children into lifeboats first, a rule he enforced rigidly. Murdoch, on the starboard side, showed more flexibility, allowing some men aboard when boats were light. The contrast between them would shape survival for hundreds. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith ordered the wireless operators to send for help with urgency. Jack Phillips tapped out the distress call again and again. CQD, CQD, Titanic, struck iceberg. Require immediate assistance, position 41°46N, 50°14W. Harold Bride, awake now, added the newer SOS for good measure. The messages leapt across the cold night, carrying hope on invisible currents. Some ships answered, but none were close enough to arrive quickly. The Carpathia, over 50 miles away, turned at once, but she could not arrive for hours. The Californian, less than 20 miles distant, remained silent. Her wireless operator had gone to bed. Passengers still lingered in lounges. Some gathered blankets and ventured onto deck, laughing nervously. The schoolmaster joined a group near lifeboat number 9. He watched sailors ready the ropes and tackle. A few women hesitated, unwilling to climb into the small craft suspended high above the sea. To them, the enormous ship beneath their feet felt far safer than a narrow boat swaying in the freezing wind. Officers coaxed and ordered, but the boats filled slowly. In first class, Lady Duff Gordon stepped into a boat with her husband, Lucille. They looked uncomfortable, as though they were stepping into inconvenience rather than danger. Others lingered, still convinced the Titanic would float until help arrived. The calm of wealth and confidence was hard to break. By 12:15 a.m., water had reached the crew quarters far forward. Sailors scrambled aft, reporting that the lower decks were filling quickly. Andrews, his face grave, moved from group to group, urging passengers to put on life jackets and take the danger seriously. His knowledge was absolute. Titanic would sink. He told anyone who would listen, "You must get into the boats." Yet many still hesitated. The lights glowed warmly. The decks seemed stable. There was no chaos, no dramatic lurch to signal doom. How could such a ship be in mortal danger? That question hovered in the cold air, unanswered, as sailors shouted for women and children to step forward. At 12:25, the first boat, number 7, lowered from the starboard side with only about half its capacity filled. It could hold 65, but carried barely 28. Passengers left behind watched it descend with a mixture of relief and amusement, certain it was only an exercise. Few believed those boats would soon become the dividing line between life and death. The clock crept toward 12:30 a.m., and the night was no longer calm in spirit. The first boat had gone down with far too few people aboard, and officers knew they had to work faster. Still, confusion lingered. Many passengers resisted leaving the ship, clinging to the sense of safety provided by its immense size. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch oversaw preparations with steady urgency. He urged women forward, trying to fill the boats. At lifeboat number 5, the same reluctance played out. Only a handful of women and children stepped forward. A few men were allowed in, including J. Bruce Ismay, who hovered nearby, anxious but useful in coaxing passengers to take places. The boat descended into the dark water, carrying around 40 people, again far fewer than capacity. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller held rigidly to the rule, women and children only. At lifeboat number 6, he ordered men back despite protests. Among those who entered was Margaret Brown, who would later earn fame as the unsinkable Molly. She wrapped herself in a heavy coat, urging others to do the same. The boat lowered into the night, guided by Quartermaster Robert Hishins. The passengers huddled together, shivering as the Titanic's towering side slid upward above them. Inside the ship, stewards moved from cabin to cabin, urging passengers to put on life jackets. Some laughed, refusing to budge. Others reluctantly dressed and followed the steady stream toward the decks. In third class, the task was hardest. Locked gates and confusing passageways slowed movement. Many families crowded corridors, uncertain where to go. Language barriers deepened the confusion. Some stewards tried to guide them, others did not return. The delay cost precious time. By 12:45, more boats swung out. Number 3 lowered with only 32 aboard. Number 8 left half empty, though Isidore and Ida Strauss declined seats. Witnesses later remembered Ida saying she would not leave her husband. "We have lived together, and we will die together." The moment passed quietly, unnoticed by most, but it would become one of the night's enduring images of devotion. Our schoolmaster, watching from the rail, felt torn between disbelief and rising fear. The ship still seemed steady under his feet, the decks brightly lit, the band playing soft tunes to soothe nerves. Yet the sight of boats vanishing into the black water unsettled him deeply. He pulled his coat tighter and scribbled a note in his pocket diary. "Boats going down. Few believe we are in danger." In the wireless room, Jack Phillips worked furiously. His signals crackled across the night, reaching ships scattered far away. The Carpathia confirmed she was steaming full speed toward them, but she was at least 4 hours distant. Other ships responded too, but none were close. The Californian, just 20 miles away, remained silent, her operator asleep. The despair in the operator's cabin grew, though they masked it with relentless work. On deck, the tilt of the ship grew noticeable. Passengers remarked uneasily that the bow seemed lower, the stern higher. A few stewards now spoke more bluntly, urging people into boats. Sailors shouted orders as ropes squealed through pulleys. The band shifted its music to hymns and ragtime, trying to calm the crowd. The familiar notes floated eerily across the freezing air, a reminder of civility amid the creeping chaos. At 1 a.m., the urgency deepened. Lifeboat number 1, a small emergency cutter, lowered with only 12 people aboard, most of them crew and a few wealthy passengers. Among them was Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Lucille. Their nearly empty boat would later stir bitter controversy, seen as a symbol of privilege and wasted chance. Lightoller pressed his side hard, filling boat after boat with women and children. Boat number 10 left with families from steerage who had finally reached the deck. Their frightened faces stared upward as the great ship loomed above, her lights blazing, her deck still crowded. Benjamin Guggenheim appeared on deck dressed in evening wear, having changed deliberately. With his valet beside him, he declared to others, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He refused a seat in the boats, sending women forward instead. His calm words contrasted with the growing anxiety around him. Below decks, water surged relentlessly aft. The forward holds and boiler rooms were drowned. Engineers and firemen still labored, keeping lights and pumps running, buying precious minutes. Their sacrifice went unseen by the majority above, yet without them, Titanic would have plunged faster into the sea. Our schoolmaster now felt the fear gnaw at him. He tried to encourage others nearby, urging them toward the boats, but many still resisted. Some said, "This ship cannot sink." Others laughed nervously, unwilling to accept the truth. He considered stepping into a boat himself, but hesitated. The sight of the half-empty craft leaving earlier troubled him. Should he wait? Should he trust the officers' calm voices or the icy logic of his own eyes? By 1:15 a.m., about 10 boats had been lowered, most only half full. The great liner still shone with light, her band still played, but the sea was rising against her bow. A subtle shift ran through the crowd, a dawning realization that the unthinkable might, in fact, be true. The unsinkable Titanic was sinking. By 1:20 a.m., the illusion of safety had slipped away. The bow was noticeably lower, and water was already washing across the well deck. The ship no longer felt steady underfoot. Passengers clutched railings, peering uneasily at the slant of the horizon. Officers shouted for women and children, their voices edged with urgency. The calm order of the first half hour was breaking. Lifeboat number 11 lowered with a full load of about 70 people, one of the first boats to leave near capacity. Families from steerage had finally reached the deck after winding through confusing passageways. Children cried as sailors bundled them into the swinging boat. Mothers clung to infants and toddlers while fathers were forced back, watching helplessly as their loved ones dropped into the Black Sea. On the port side, Charles Lightoller enforced his rule with near fanatical discipline. Only women and children could enter. At boat number 14, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe threatened to fire his revolver over the heads of men crowding forward. The warning worked, and the boat lowered with 60 aboard. Women huddled together under blankets. Lowe promised them he would return if he could, though in his heart he doubted it. On the starboard side, Murdoch showed more flexibility. He allowed a few men to board when women hesitated. This difference in approach meant more lives saved on his side, though at the time it seemed a small, practical measure. The fate of hundreds turned on these subtle choices. Our second-class schoolmaster lingered near lifeboat number 9, torn by indecision. He saw crewmen shouting for women and children, but still many passengers hung back. Some joked nervously, others insisted the ship was safer. The schoolmaster jotted quick lines in his notebook. The sea rising, ship at list, some still laughing. He watched a mother push her 2 sons into the boat, then turn back to her husband, refusing to go without him. They argued briefly before sailors forced her down after the boys. The father remained on deck, staring silently as the boat descended. Inside the wireless cabin, Jack Phillips continued to hammer his key. His hands were blistered, sweat running despite the cold. Harold Bride worked beside him, scribbling positions and relaying answers. The Carpathia promised full speed, but the distance was too great. Other ships responded, Frankfurt, Mount Temple, Baltic, but all were far. The closest ship, the Californian, remained silent. Her wireless operator asleep just 20 miles away. Bride muttered in frustration, if only he were listening. By 1:30 a.m., the forward well deck was awash. Sailors reported that the mailroom was fully flooded and water had reached the grand staircase at E deck. Panic began to ripple. Some passengers now rushed toward the boats, voices raised in fear. Stewards and sailors tried to hold them back, shouting for order. A few scuffles broke out as men attempted to climb into boats reserved for women. Officers pushed them back, revolvers glinting in the electric light. The band still played. The musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, had assembled on the boat deck and chosen light, cheerful tunes to calm the crowd. Ragtime numbers floated strangely over the chaos, a sound both reassuring and heartbreaking. Survivors would later remember it as the soundtrack of the night, civilization persisting to the last moments. Among the crowd, notable figures made their choices. John Jacob Astor placed his young wife into a lifeboat, then stood aside when the officer barred him. He called up to her with quiet reassurance that he would see her soon. Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in evening clothes, walked the deck calmly, telling stewards to save their energy for others. Isidore and Ida Strauss refused to be separated, turning back from the boats to remain together on board. Their decision moved those who witnessed it, though at the time few paused to reflect. In third class, conditions grew dire. Families crowded locked gates, begging to be let through. Some stewards finally relented, others did not. Confusion and language barriers created deadly delays. A young Irish mother clutched her baby as she tried to find a stairwell, her children crying at her heels. Around her, dozens of passengers surged, desperate to reach the upper decks. Every minute lost meant fewer seats in the boats above. By 1:40 a.m., the list was steeper. Officers ordered lifeboats filled more quickly. Number 15 lowered so heavily packed that its sides nearly touched the water. As it descended, sparks from a funnel showered onto the canvas, frightening the women and children inside. They swatted at embers with bare hands, praying the flames would not catch. Our schoolmaster finally realized hesitation was dangerous. He moved closer to the boats, searching for an opening. At number 13, he tried to step forward, but was pushed back by sailors enforcing the women and children first order. He watched in frustration as the boat descended, filled with mothers and children, and realized his chances were slipping away. At 1:45 a.m., distress rockets fired from the bridge arced into the sky, exploding in white bursts. Their glare lit the decks for a few moments at a time, reflecting off the calm sea. Passengers craned their necks to watch, convinced that nearby ships must surely see them. Far off, the Californian's watch crew saw the lights, but dismissed them as company signals. No help came. Water now lapped at the foot of the grand staircase. Stewards scrambled upward, abandoning lower decks. Cold air swept through open doors as the Atlantic pressed farther inside. Titanic was sinking by the bow, her stern rising higher. The night that began with calm confidence was sliding into terror. The clock ticked toward 1:50 a.m., and the Titanic's proud profile had altered beyond denial. The bow sank deeper into the Black Sea, her stern lifting slowly, her decks tilting enough that passengers clutched railings to steady themselves. The illusion of safety had broken. Murmurs of disbelief hardened into cries of fear. On the boat deck, rockets continued to streak into the night sky, their white glare reflecting eerily on the sea. Each burst gave passengers a fleeting view of their peril, the bow awash, the lifeboats dwindling into the darkness, the immense hull leaning forward. Those who had resisted evacuation now surged toward the remaining boats, their calm unraveling into panic. Boat number 16, filled with families from steerage, finally guided through the labyrinth of passageways. Mothers clutched crying children, their shawls pulled tight against the cold. Some fathers tried to follow, but Lightoller barred them, shouting, "Women and children only." His revolver flashed as he threatened to use it if order collapsed. The boat descended with over 50 aboard, leaving dozens more pleading at the rail. On the starboard side, Murdoch faced the same pressure, but allowed some men forward when space remained. Boat number 9 had gone half full earlier. Now he tried to avoid repeating that mistake. Boat number 11 descended so crowded that it nearly scraped the ship's side. The groan of ropes, the shouts of sailors, and the cries of children blended into a growing cacophony. At 1:55 a.m., the tilt increased again. Water spilled onto the forward well deck and surged toward the bridge. Officers reported flooding reaching the base of the first funnel. Passengers at the rails gasped, finally comprehending that the unsinkable ship was truly dying. Stewards abandoned reassurances. Now they shouted bluntly, "Get to the boats if you want to live!" Our second-class schoolmaster gripped the rail near lifeboat number 13. He watched as women were pulled forward, lifted bodily by sailors into the boat. He tried again to join them, but was shoved back. The officer barked at him to stand clear. His notebook was still tucked in his coat pocket, its pages damp from the mist of the sea. He scribbled one last hurried line. "The ship is sinking fast. They say there is room still, but not for men." The band played on, their music shifting to hymns. "Nearer, my God." To Thee, or a ragtime waltz, it would later be debated which song marked the end, but the effect was the same. The notes floated calm and steady across the icy air, a defiant gesture of order against chaos. Some passengers wept quietly at the sound. Others took comfort in its familiarity. By 2 a.m., the deck sloped so sharply that moving about became difficult. Women in long dresses stumbled. Men clutched at ladders and rails. Lifeboat number 2 was lowered with about 17 people, another example of wasted space. Boat number 4 followed, filled with women and children, including members of the Astor and Strauss households. John Jacob Astor pleaded to join his pregnant wife, but was refused. He kissed her hand and stepped back. Madeline descended without him, looking up until she vanished into the darkness. In the grand staircase, water surged up from below. The elegant glass dome above glittered under electric lights, even as cold sea pressed at the doors. Stewards fled upward, abandoning the lower decks. The ornate heart of the Titanic was being drowned floor by floor. On the bridge, Captain Smith gave his final orders. He told Phillips and Bride to send the last desperate signals. Phillips tapped with blistered fingers, his code weakening. "SOS, SOS, CQD," sinking fast. Bride strapped on his life jacket, ready to run. Smith released them from duty, telling them they had done their part. The captain then vanished into the ship, seen by some moving calmly through the wheelhouse, by others stepping silently onto the bridge to face his fate. In steerage, chaos reigned. Families pressed through narrow stairwells, some climbing over locked gates in desperation. A few sailors finally forced doors open, letting dozens rush upward. Women carried children on their shoulders. Men carried bundles and bags, unwilling to abandon everything they owned. The list of the ship made climbing harder with every minute. For many, it was already too late. The last boats were nearly gone. At 2:05 a.m., collapsible boat D was loaded hastily on the port side. Lightoller forced women and children forward until the canvas boat brimmed with over 40. Men were shoved back at gunpoint. It lowered just as water swept across the deck nearby. On the starboard side, collapsible boat C was launched, carrying Ismay, who climbed in at the last moment. His decision would shadow him for the rest of his life. Our schoolmaster pressed near collapsible boat D, but again he was denied. He clung to the rail, shivering, watching as the canvas boat dropped into the sea. Around him the crowd grew desperate. Some prayed aloud. Others shouted at officers demanding space. The tilt of the deck forced them closer together, bodies pressing shoulder to shoulder. By 2:10 a.m., only collapsibles A and B remained, still lashed to the roof of the officers' quarters. Sailors struggled to free them as water rushed toward the base of the forward funnel. The bow was almost submerged. Titanic's stern lifted higher, its propellers nearly visible above the waterline. The great liner groaned as her steel bulk strained against forces she had never been designed to withstand. The point of no return had come. By 2:15 a.m., the Titanic was a changed ship. The bow had vanished beneath the sea, swallowed whole. Water rushed across the boat deck, swirling around the base of the first funnel. The stern rose higher, tilting the decks at a frightening angle. Passengers clung to railings, benches, and one another, struggling to maintain footing. The once proud liner groaned under the strain, a giant twisting against its death. Only 2 collapsible boats remained, A and B, still lashed to the roof of the officers' quarters. Sailors swarmed over them, hacking at lashings with knives, desperate to free the canvas craft before the sea reached them. Collapsible D, lowered minutes earlier, had already pulled away, crowded with women and children. The deck was now thronged with hundreds who had no place left to go. On the port side, Lightoller organized men to heave collapsible A toward the edge. The deck slanted steeply, and the boat slid as they struggled, nearly toppling into the crowd. Passengers shouted in terror as sailors fought to control it. Finally, it crashed onto the deck upside down, water swirling around its edges. Men tried frantically to right it, but the rising sea was faster. Nearby, collapsible B was wrestled free. Chief Officer Henry Wilde and other sailors dragged it toward the starboard side, hoping to float it off as the water reached them. In the rush, the boat also overturned, landing on its canvas roof. Still, some saw hope. As the sea poured across the deck, men scrambled onto the upturned hull, clinging desperately as water surged around their legs. Among them was wireless operator Harold Bride, battered but alive after escaping the Marconi room. Others, including Second Officer Lightoller, would later cling to it as well. Our second-class schoolmaster, pressed against the rail, saw the collapsibles fall. He surged forward with dozens of others, desperate for a chance. The crush of bodies forced him back. Men shouted, cursed, and prayed in a dozen languages. The tilt of the deck pitched them forward, knocking some to their knees. He clung to a vent pipe, his notebook still jammed in his pocket. But now there was no time for writing. Only survival mattered. At 2:17 a.m., Titanic's first funnel collapsed. It snapped free with a roar, crashing down onto the water and striking swimmers below. Some were killed instantly, others clung to wreckage thrown clear by the impact. The wave from the falling funnel washed one of the collapsibles clear, sending it drifting with men already clambering aboard. Survivors later recalled the terrible scream of steel tearing and the cries of those caught beneath. On the deck, chaos reigned. The band had played to the very end, but now their music stopped. Wallace Hartley and his fellow musicians laid down their instruments. Some survivors claimed their last song was the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Others remembered light ragtime. Either way, their final notes became one of the enduring legends of the night, a symbol of dignity against despair. Captain Smith was last seen moving through the bridge, giving calm orders. Some claimed he released crew from duty, telling them to save themselves. Others believed he chose to remain at his post to the end. His exact fate was never confirmed, but the image of the grey-haired captain facing the sea became legend. Below, engineers and firemen still laboured at pumps and dynamos, keeping lights burning even as water closed over their stations. Their sacrifice meant that the Titanic remained illuminated until her final moments, sparing passengers the terror of total darkness. None of those men survived. By 2:18 a.m., panic overtook discipline. Passengers surged toward the stern as the bow plunged deeper. Some leapt into the sea, preferring the icy water to the tilting deck. Others crouched in prayer, clinging to companions. Families huddled together, refusing to be parted. Mothers clutched children, whispering comfort even as despair clouded their eyes. The cries of the crowd rose, a haunting chorus of fear carried on the freezing wind. Our schoolmaster fought to keep his footing as the deck steepened. He joined a cluster moving aft, stepping over abandoned chairs, ropes and lifebelts. The once elegant promenade was now chaos, littered with the remnants of a sinking world. Somewhere ahead, the great dome of the grand staircase glowed under its lights, water already lapping at its edges. At 2:19 a.m., Phillips, the exhausted wireless operator, sent his last signal before fleeing the cabin. Bride staggered beside him, the two men now just passengers among hundreds facing the same fate. The wireless key fell silent forever, its desperate sparks gone. The Titanic groaned once more, her stern lifting higher. Stars shone coldly above. Lifeboats bobbed far away, filled with survivors who could only watch in horror as the giant ship writhed in her death throes. The last boats were gone. For those still aboard, there was no escape but the sea. At 2:18 a.m., the Titanic reached the threshold of destruction. The bow was entirely submerged, and the stern rose nearly 45 degrees. The ship's massive frame trembled under the strain, steel plates shrieking as rivets popped like gunfire. Passengers clung to rails, ladders, and one another, bracing against the steep incline. Every movement now was a fight against gravity. Our schoolmaster, pressed among the crowd at the stern, felt his legs quiver as he clung to an iron railing. Around him, men prayed aloud, women sobbed, and children wailed. Others were grimly silent, staring upward at the stars as though salvation might descend from heaven itself. The smell of coal smoke and cold brine filled the air, mingling with the faint strains of human voices crying out. At 2:19 a.m., a tremendous crack split the night. The Titanic's steel spine gave way between the third and fourth funnels. Witnesses described the sound as like thunder or the roar of distant guns. The great liner broke in two. The forward section plunged instantly, dragging hundreds into the depths. People on deck screamed as they felt the ship lurch violently beneath them. Those in the water were sucked downward in the whirlpool created by the falling bow. For a moment, the stern settled back onto the sea, level again, as if buoyed by some final breath. Survivors in lifeboats later described the eerie sight of the ship's rear half floating upright, lights still burning, people crowded shoulder to shoulder along every rail. It was a vision both surreal and terrible, a ghostly remnant of the world's largest ship, cut in half yet still clinging to life. But the respite lasted less than a minute. Water poured into the gaping break, flooding compartments at an unstoppable rate. The stern began to rise again, steeper and steeper, its three massive propellers lifting clear of the sea. Men and women slid along the deck, tumbling into railings or overboard. Furniture, deck chairs, and debris clattered downward. Some passengers tied themselves to railings in futile hope. Others leapt into the black water, arms flailing as they vanished. Our schoolmaster fought against the tilt, gripping the railing with white knuckles. A man beside him lost his grip and slid screaming into the abyss. Another clambered upward, clawing at the ironwork to reach higher ground. The schoolmaster thought briefly of home, of his family and his classroom, of the ordinary life that seemed impossibly far away. He whispered a prayer, though he could not hear his own voice over the roaring din. The stern now stood nearly vertical. Survivors in the lifeboats described it as a tower of light, pointing straight into the sky. The remaining electric power flickered, then died with a final shudder. Darkness fell at last, broken only by the stars and the eerie white glow of rockets still drifting back to Earth. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic gave her last groan. The stern rose high, hung there for a breathless moment, then plunged downward. The weight of machinery, boilers and steel dragged it swiftly. The sea closed over the ship, swallowing her whole. In less than 3 hours since striking the iceberg, the world's largest ship had vanished beneath the Atlantic. Silence followed, but only for an instant. Then came the cries. The water was near freezing, around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Within minutes, shock and hypothermia gripped the hundreds who had leapt or been swept into the sea. Their screams filled the night, a piercing chorus of agony that rolled across the waves. Survivors in lifeboats would never forget that sound, the desperate cries of men, women and children calling for help that could not come. The lifeboats floated at a distance, their occupants staring in horror. Some begged to return and rescue those in the water. Others feared that if they rowed back, panicked swimmers would swamp their boats. Officers in command made decisions on the spot. Some held fast, others relented. Boat number 14 under Harold Lowe eventually pulled back and managed to rescue a handful of half-frozen survivors. Most boats, however, stayed away, haunted by the cries but paralyzed by fear of being overwhelmed. Our schoolmaster was among those swept into the icy Atlantic. The cold struck him like a hammer, stealing his breath. He thrashed among wreckage, reaching instinctively for anything that would float. His fingers found a piece of wood, splintered from the ship's fittings, and he clung desperately, his lungs searing. All around him, faces bobbed in the black water, mouths open in cries that grew fainter as the cold claimed them. Above, stars glittered indifferently. The great ship was gone, replaced by scattered debris and tiny lifeboats adrift in the dark. The Atlantic rolled back into silence, leaving only human voices to mark the catastrophe. Within half an hour, most of those voices would be stilled by the merciless cold. The Titanic was gone. At 2:20 a.m., the last trace of her disappeared beneath the Atlantic, leaving behind an ocean strewn with wreckage and human souls. For a few moments, the world seemed impossibly quiet. Then, the silence shattered. The cries began as a single wail, then multiplied into hundreds, the night filled with the desperate voices of men, women and children struggling in the freezing water. Survivors in the lifeboats described it as the most terrible sound they had ever heard, a great chorus of human suffering, pleading, gasping, shrieking. It carried across the calm sea, rising and falling in waves, until the very stars seemed to tremble at the sound. Our second-class schoolmaster clung to a piece of wreckage, his body numb with cold. His fingers burned, then turned wooden, refusing to obey. The water crushed his chest, each breath shorter than the last. Around him, faces appeared and vanished, mouths open in silent screams as hypothermia stole their voices. He prayed for strength, prayed for rescue, prayed for anything but the cold that gnawed at his bones. In the lifeboats, arguments broke out. Some begged the sailors to row back and save as many as they could. Others, terrified of being swamped, demanded they stay away. Boat number 6, commanded by Quartermaster Hykins, refused to return, despite the protests of Margaret Brown and others. Boat number 14, under Harold Lowe, eventually transferred passengers to other craft and turned back, pulling a handful of frozen survivors from the water. By then, hundreds had already succumbed. The cries gradually diminished. First the frantic shouts, then the moans, then only a few faint voices scattered across the dark. Within 30 minutes, nearly all was silent. Survivors never forgot the sound. One woman later said it was a dreadful moan that died slowly into silence. For those in the boats, the memory of not rowing back, of hearing and not helping, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside boat number 8, passengers huddled together, shivering under thin blankets. Some whispered prayers, others sat mute, staring into the dark where the ship had been. In boat number 1, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucille sat among only a dozen souls, their boat nearly empty, while hundreds perished yards away. Rumours of bribery and selfishness would later cling to them, though they denied it fiercely. On the upturned hull of collapsible B, Lightoller, Harold Bride, and nearly 30 others clung in misery. Waves sloshed across the slippery canvas roof. Men shifted constantly, trying to balance the unstable boat. Some slipped into the sea and did not return. In the darkness, they could see stars reflected in the water and hear faint groans from the dying, but no lifeboat came to them until dawn. Our schoolmaster drifted in and out of consciousness. He thought of home, of students waiting for lessons that would never come, of family who would never hear his story. His grip loosened, but instinct forced him to cling tighter to the wood. He could no longer feel his legs. The cold had claimed him, yet some part of his mind refused surrender. He prayed again, words slurring into silence. In boat number 12, steerage families pressed together, sharing shawls and coats. Children whimpered as mothers rocked them. The men who had been allowed aboard pulled at oars with numb hands. A sailor called out for them to row away from the cries, away from the suction, away from the ghosts of the great ship. They obeyed, though their eyes never left the spot where Titanic had gone down. By 3 a.m. the Atlantic was quiet again. The night was bitterly cold, the sea calm, the stars cruelly bright. The lifeboats drifted, scattered across the dark. Some kept close to one another, others floated alone, their passengers silent with shock. They had escaped, but now they faced long hours in the freezing night with no certainty of rescue. Captain Smith was gone. Thomas Andrews was gone. John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss, all gone. Over 1,500 souls were lost, their lives snuffed out in less than 3 hours. The survivors sat in fragile boats, their grief suspended by exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where they prayed to see a rescue ship's lights. For now, there was only the Black Sea, the faint slap of oars, and the memory of voices fading into silence. The night dragged on, bitter and endless. After the last cries faded, silence returned to the Atlantic. The survivors drifted in lifeboats, their bodies stiff with cold, their minds heavy with shock. Time seemed to stop. Watches and clocks had been lost, and only the slow paling of the eastern sky told them that dawn approached. By 4 a.m. the horizon lightened. A grey band of morning revealed the reality of their situation. Debris floated everywhere, deck chairs, planks, life jackets, pieces of panelling. Here and there the still bodies of those who had not survived drifted among the wreckage. Survivors averted their eyes, though they could not forget the faces of those they had left behind. On the upturned hull of collapsible B, Lightoller still clung with nearly 30 others. The night had nearly broken them. Several had died sliding into the sea. Harold Bride, half frozen, drifted in and out of consciousness, his feet numb and useless. The men balanced precariously, soaked by waves, waiting for a miracle. In other boats, tempers frayed. Some accused sailors of cowardice for not returning to rescue those in the water. Others quarreled about rowing or directions. The silence of shock gave way to exhaustion, anger, and despair. A few still prayed aloud, their voices hoarse and cracked. Children whimpered, and mothers hushed them with promises that help was coming. And then, at last, it did. At 4:10 a.m., the lights of the Carpathia appeared on the horizon. A cry of joy went up from the lifeboats. For the first time since the Titanic's final plunge, hope returned. The little Cunard liner, under Captain Arthur Rostron, had steamed at full speed through ice fields, her crew readying blankets, medical stations, and hot drinks. She had answered the Titanic's call and come as quickly as humanly possible. By 4:30 a.m., the first lifeboat reached her side. Survivors were hauled aboard by ropes and ladders, some too numb to climb, others carried by sailors. Women collapsed into the arms of nurses. Children were wrapped in blankets and carried below decks. Strong men wept openly as they stumbled onto safety. Boat after boat came alongside. The process took hours. Over 700 survivors were rescued, shivering, exhausted, yet alive. Many had frostbitten hands and feet. Others were in shock, unable to speak. Still others refused to rest, searching desperately for husbands, wives, or children who would never come. Our second-class schoolmaster, against all odds, had clung to wreckage through the night. When Boat 14 rowed back after transferring passengers, sailors found him barely conscious. He was hauled over the gunwale, his lips blue, his body stiff. In his pocket, waterlogged but legible, was his small notebook with hurried notes of the night's events. His testimony would later echo the voices of countless others who bore witness to the tragedy. By 8:30 a.m., all known survivors were aboard Carpathia. The rescue ship's decks were crowded with grief and relief. Blankets covered the shivering, coffee and brandy revived the faint, and Rostron himself moved among them, offering words of comfort. But the shadow of loss hung heavy. More than 1,500 had perished in the night. As the Carpathia turned toward New York, survivors lined her rails. They looked back at the empty sea, now calm and deceptively peaceful. Some whispered prayers. Others wept silently. A few stared in numb disbelief. The great Titanic, pride of the White Star Line, the unsinkable ship, lay broken on the ocean floor, her story already legend. The days that followed were filled with grief and inquiry. In New York, crowds gathered to meet the Carpathia. Families waited anxiously on the pier, praying to see familiar faces. For many, the news was crushing. Sons, daughters, husbands, wives lost forever. Committees convened on both sides of the Atlantic. Survivors gave testimony. Officers and crew recounted the confusion, the courage, and the failures. The world demanded answers. The inquiries revealed flaws, too few lifeboats, ignored ice warnings, misplaced confidence. They also revealed heroism. Men who stayed at their posts, women who comforted strangers, musicians who played to the end, engineers who kept the lights burning. The Titanic's loss changed maritime law forever. New regulations required lifeboats for all aboard, 24-hour wireless watches, and stricter ice patrols. Yet beyond the rules, the Titanic remained a symbol. For some, she represented the hubris of mankind, the arrogance of declaring any creation unsinkable. For others, she embodied courage in the face of certain death, the dignity of those who went down with her, and the devotion of those who refused to abandon loved ones. Her story was both warning and inspiration. For the survivors, the memory never faded. The sight of rockets bursting in the sky, the sound of the band, the cries in the dark, all lingered for a lifetime. Some, like Margaret Brown, turned grief into action, raising funds for the destitute and honoring the lost. Others, like J. Bruce Ismay, carried the burden of guilt, vilified for stepping into a lifeboat while so many perished. Each survivor bore their own truth, their own scar. Our schoolmaster, who had scribbled notes on the voyage and clung to life through the cold Atlantic, returned to shore changed forever. His diary became a record not just of events, but of humanity revealed in extremes: fear, sacrifice, selfishness, and love. He lived with the knowledge that survival was as much chance as choice, that history had marked him witness to one of the greatest tragedies of the modern age. On April 18, 1912, the Carpathia steamed into New York Harbor. Rain fell as she approached. Tens of thousands lined the docks in silence, hats removed, watching as lifeboats and survivors were lowered to the pier. Church bells tolled across the city. A reporter described the scene as a city holding its breath. The Titanic was gone, but her story had only begun.